Manchester has a lot of iconic pubs, the best being those of a more historic vintage. And if you're a visitor to the city, one of the first you'll learn about, and probably visit, is this one. Well, these two. The Old Wellington and Sinclair's Oyster Bar. Set in what has recently been dubbed the medieval quarter of Manchester, these are two of the last remaining Tudor-looking buildings in the entire city, and they fit their environments very snugly. Behind them is the cathedral and a street pattern that goes back centuries. And it's easy to look at this little square, known as Shambles Square, and draw comparison to similar looking buildings in other English cities, most notably the street in York, also called the Shambles. But it's fairly common knowledge that these two pubs were actually moved to this location not too long ago to accommodate the regeneration of the area. But few people realise where they used to be, how they were moved, why they were preserved in the first place, or that, in fact, they weren't moved just once, but twice. So let's go back to the start, the 16th century, when the oldest of these two pubs was built, the Old Wellington, dating back to 1552. To put that into historical context, that's just 5 years after Henry VIII had died. In the 1500s, Manchester was still a small village, barely registering on maps or in historical accounts. A map from 1650, a century after the Old Wellington was built, shows just how small Manchester still was. Everything was centred around the cathedral and the bridge over the River Irwell to Salford. To focus in on this place, we've got to go to a more detailed map, so we have to skip ahead a couple of centuries. Looking at later maps of Manchester shows the city growing slowly at first and then incredibly rapidly from the beginning of the 1800s. Now nearly all of these subsequent maps show this strange dark line here, an area cutting across the tip of a quite distinctive triangle. To see what's going on around this vague and undetailed world, we have to jump to this map from 1850. Now this is one of my favourite maps of the city, not just because it's beautifully and painstakingly detailing the city street by street, but it also picks out prominent buildings like the cathedral or the old town hall on King Street, and shows how they were set out on the inside. If we zoom into the market area, we see the mysterious dark block revealed. It's a fish and game market running down a street called the Old Shambles. Shambles is a word that used to be used in English commonly to refer to the wood in a street of butchers where animals were slaughtered and their meat sold. But let's not get it wrong here, it's easy to paint a theme park image of market stalls in the Middle Ages, but this was not a nice place to be. A shambles street would have had blood, pieces of meat and offal running down the gutters. The stench would have been awful, the hygiene completely lacking. It's not really surprising that by the 19th century, the word shambles had become a generic word for disorder and mess. The other great thing about this map is that it names nearly every pub it covers, including this one, the Wellington Inn. This is the original home of the pub we're looking at, and for reference, that's here. But this is 1850. In 1552, when it was built, it wasn't a pub, but a house, and was purchased by the wealthy Byrom family a couple of years later. They turned it into a draper's shop and lived above it. It stayed in their family right up until 1692, when John Byrom, poet, writer and inventor of an early form of shorthand, was born here. In about 1738, an extension was added to the building separate to the shop and became Manchester's first gentleman's club, John Shaw's Punch House. As the name suggests, it became well known for its punch, which was said to be so strong that most people couldn't handle more than one drink. Shaw was a former army man and a strict disciplinarian, and possibly also a little unhinged. And he used to close the establishment at 8 PM sharp every night, announcing last orders with the crack of a bullwhip. Anyone hanging back to try and stay a little longer and have a little bit more to drink was swept away by Molly, the servant, who would flood the floor with water and begin mopping without regard for who was still there and who was now having to go home with wet feet. Shaw ran the pub for 58 years until 1796, when it became known as Sinclair's. Oysters were added to the menu, and in 1845 it took up its current name of Sinclair's Oyster Bar. Oysters, of course, are today a delicacy for people who have too much money, but back in the 19th century they were considered the food of the poor. In 1830, the year the Liverpool-Manchester Railway was opened and the Duke of Wellington was booed on his arrival into Manchester, the former Byram's Drapery was granted a licence and became known as the Vintners Arms, and then later Kenyon Vaults. It changed its name again to the Wellington Inn, after the Duke. It was a pub downstairs and a workshop for optical instruments upstairs, which is why this famous photo of the pub has these rather wacky eyeglasses. So just to allow ourselves to get sidetracked for a minute, in the 1820s most of this old food market had moved to other parts of the city, the fish market famously taking residence here to the covered Smithfield Market. Market Place now became Manchester's top drinking spot, home to pubs like the Slip Inn, a favourite of Charlie Chaplin. Now, during the Victorian redevelopment of the city, lots of the oldest buildings were torn down to make way for new road layouts and new stone exchanges, but surprisingly, this area survived all of that. However, during the 20th century, Manchester city centre underwent 3 more major destructive periods. The first was the bombing of the Second World War, which destroyed much of the remaining timber buildings. But somehow, the old wooden Wellington still survived. The second was the regeneration of the 1970s, which embraced soulless, concrete simplicity. At this point, we are introduced to the villain of the story, Marks and Spencer, the bland retail giant that pretends to be more upmarket than it actually is. Now, okay, maybe it's not fair to pick on Marks and Spencer quite yet, at least. But pressure from big commerce on town planners in the 60s and 70s certainly played a big part in the bleak reimagining of what city centres up and down the country should look like. And here in the old beating heart of Manchester, that meant this: a grey concrete clad shopping precinct overshadowed by a huge blocky shop for a certain company. All of this area, in fact, the old Manchester, the tough Manchester that has survived the Blitz, was wiped away in the 70s to make way for the Arndale shopping centre. And part of the big idea for the precinct over here was to create one single level shopping experience from the Arndale through to Deansgate. This meant having to raise the street level here several feet to match. Now, both pubs have been listed since the 1950s, and thankfully planners couldn't quite bring themselves to knocking them down, and so they decided to lift them up instead, allowing a road to slip underneath. Ingeniously, the buildings were underpinned with stilts and a steel and concrete raft, and then raised bit by bit using hydraulic jacks. The lifting process took 3 months, beginning in July 1971, and by October 27th, the buildings had been sufficiently raised by about 1.4 metres or 4 foot 9 inches to meet the new street level. And so here they sat, lone survivors of a time now past. 2 jaggedy timber buildings slumped at the side of a square like a couple of drunken old men trying to take in the changing world around them. Trapped in an open-air prison, the last indigenous holdouts of a new concrete colony. That was until 1996, when this happened. The detonation of an IRA bomb just around the corner on Corporation Street caused widespread damage to buildings far and wide. Thankfully, most just suffering from broken windows, but it provided an opportunity to re-evaluate this part of the city. Sins of the 70s wouldn't be completely undone, but by the late 1990s it was almost universally accepted that this modernist vision of city planning, mixed with such overt dedication to retail capitalism, did not a happy city make. One of them had to go, and of course, it was the architecture. And this is where Marks and Spencer come rolling back in. They were having a new store built in place of the damaged one and pressured the council to let them extend even further this way into the old market square. This was so they could have the biggest M&S store in the world, as if anybody really cared, at 32,500 square metres, and was enough to reshape the entire street pattern. As a result, all of this area would be simplified into the single new Cathedral Street, flanked on both sides by department stores. And I know I've been pretty dismissive and sarcastic about the 20th century changes to this part of the city, but New Cathedral Street actually did something quite clever. It opened up a direct line of sight between St Anne's Square down here and the cathedral up here. But at last, this ancient heart of the city, where generation after generation of Mancunian bartered at market stalls, plying their various trades and skills amongst the winding shambles streets, the town stocks where people were punished, where soldiers gathered, where proclamations were made, and where the first death of the English Civil War occurred, gave way to yet another soulless, yuppie paradise that will no doubt one day make future generations cringe. Forcing a big decision to be made about the last Tudor-style buildings in the city centre. Not including the Shakespeare pub, of course, but that was brought in from Chester in the 1920s, so that doesn't really count. So now we come to an important juncture. It's crucial to understand two more things. First, we like timber buildings like this. We always have. It's not just a recent phenomenon. They are pleasing to look at, and they are very, very, very relatable on a human level. Stone buildings like the Royal Exchange, while grand and impressive, feel a little unemotional sometimes, standoffish. And buildings like this even more so. And the second thing to understand is something you might have noticed already if you were sharp earlier on, that Sinclair's isn't a true timber building. It's brick, stuccoed and painted black and white to look like it's timber. More evidence that we just love this particular look. So when the concrete hellscape of the 1970s was replaced with a glass and stone clad corporate hellscape of the 90s, there was real pressure on all sides to make sure that the Old Wellington and Sinclair's were saved somehow. And that meant moving them 70 metres to here, where they would sit on the edge of the newly created Exchange Square and beside the old Corn Exchange. To fit in the smaller square, the pubs would have to be set at right angles to each other. The dismantling of the pubs was completed in March 1998. 25,000 bricks, hundreds of pieces of timber, seats and staircases were meticulously taken apart, numbered, coded, photographed and stored on a computer before work began. When reconstruction commenced, 4 carpenters worked constantly on it, painstakingly piecing the buildings back together. Sinclair's might seem to have a shorter yet more interesting history, but the Old Wellington is a weird old place too. Firstly, it's named after this guy, the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, a deeply unpopular figure in Manchester during his lifetime as he opposed most working class rights. Secondly, the sign here falsely claims that the Old Wellington is Manchester's oldest building when it's just not. Chetham's library was built over a century before in 1421 to accommodate a college of priests. It might have a timber frame, but it sits on a bed of lies. But in essence, this is still a lovely place to be, surrounded by dark wood, alcoholic beverages, and a lot of lovely history. And looking at the story of both these pubs is really looking at the story of Manchester itself.